Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for October the 12th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. So we have for our text today, we have 1 Kings 15. We've got Colossians 2. Then we have Ezekiel 45. And then finally Psalm 99 through 101. So we've got 3 Psalms today. But why don't we jump right on into Colossians chapter 2. So remember that part of Paul's purpose, I guess, in writing the letter to the church at Colossae was addressing the specific issue of false teaching. Again, the church was doing well, but there was that danger of false teaching. Now, what were the elements of the false teaching? Well, first of all, there was this sense of them having these people who were claiming that they had an elite knowledge. They had a special knowledge that no one else knew about. So look at verse 4, for instance, here. I say this, Paul says, so that no one will delude you with persuasive argument. Or, especially in verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of this world, rather than according to Christ. So they're claiming that, hey, we've got this knowledge you don't have. So that's one thing of their heresy, I guess you could say. Another is that they were engaged in some aesthetic practices. In other words, denying themselves of pleasure and these types of things, and then perhaps even an observance of certain other practices of certain days. And then finally, the veneration of angels. You see this in verse 18. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by a fleshly mind. So putting all those together, by the way, you see all 3 of those really in verse 18. You kind of have this situation where these false teachers believe that with secret knowledge and with aestheticism, with denying themselves of food and of comforts and these types of things, possibly by doing those things they would receive visions, maybe even visions of angels at worship that would qualify them to have this higher spirituality. So it was ultimately at root grounded in the pride of these false teachers, right? So this is what Paul is arguing against, and to the contrary, he argues that all wisdom and understanding and insight comes directly from the Spirit. He does this in chapter 1, and again, as we mentioned yesterday, he talks about this, argues against angels being venerated because Christ is preeminent and Lord of all. In fact, he argues in verse 9 of this chapter, for in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. So in Christ, you have all that you need, everything that you need. Verses 8 through 15 really speak to this in this particular text. So still, this is, Paul in his letters has that movement typically between the theology going to application, and really starting with verse 16 of this text, he starts moving to more application, and we'll see that work itself out throughout the rest of the chapters of the book of Colossians. So that's Colossians 2. Let's move on we'll go over to Psalm 99 through 101. So Psalm 99 is the last of those Yahweh Malak Psalms, those Psalms that celebrate the kingship of the Lord. This is one of the more striking ones, I think. Once again, it begins, the Lord reigns. So there's that, where we get that title. It pictures, again, God as king. And of course, he is reigning in Zion. This is the place of his temple, the place of his rule, even through the Davidic king. But he is exalted over all the peoples. So we have this picture of God having a focused presence in one area, but really having a reign that expands over all other things. He is a king who, verse 4, he loves justice and he establishes equity, justice, and righteousness. And there are these calls, of course, to exalt him. Then in chapter Psalm 100, this is a psalm I actually preached on a few Thanksgivings ago, and I think appropriately so, because Psalm 100 is a psalm of thanksgiving. In fact, it's the only one that has that title in the text, a psalm for thanksgiving. And we see that this is this is actually mentioned in the text as well. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, enter his courts with praise. So it's very fitting. And I think remember what the Psalms are there for. We talked about this extensively on Sunday, that these Psalms are there to shape our hearts, right? And so this is a psalm that shapes our hearts to be thankful hearts, and thankful specifically for several things. Thanking God specifically for who he is, his goodness, and how he has displayed that in our lives, his loving kindness and his faithfulness. Again, those two words, very significant words in the Hebrew text. Anytime we come across them, they're usually, these are kind of our word pair. In other words, they occur a lot together, and they describe the character of God within his covenant relationship with his people. Kind of a synopsis of it. That's the Hebrew word chesed and the Hebrew word emeth. And by the way, I think I've mentioned this before. When we get to John 1, it talks about how the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Same words are behind that, right? And so this is the character of God that we need to thank him for, and yet we see it manifested and personified in the person of Jesus Christ. And Psalm 101 is a psalm that it's kind of a little bit hard to characterize and actually describe what was it originally intended for. Some have hypothesized, although this is unsure, that it was a temple entrance psalm. So a psalm that you would sing or recite as you're entering into the temple is similar to, for instance, Psalm 15 in this way. Talking about the character of the individuals, the individual might be proclaiming, okay, this is my character as I go into the temple. But even more so, I think what it's doing, it's again a community shaping, heart shaping psalm. So what kind of heart does God desire us to have? Well, verse 2 and following give us that heart, right? It's a heart that walks with integrity, that sets no worthless things before his eyes. In other words, probably here referring to idols and things like that, but I think we could probably expand that out to a lot of things, couldn't we? Setting no worthless things before our eyes, hating the work of those who fall away, it shall not fasten its grip on me, perverse heart shall depart from me, twisted, it's another way of wording that, not knowing any evil, and so on and so forth. So as you read text like this, I think this is a good text to say, to pray through ultimately and say, God, give me these things. Give me this heart. Give me this type of integrity in my life, and allow this psalm by not memorizing, you could, I guess, but by reciting it, by meditating on it, allow that psalm to shape your heart towards those holy aspirations that are listed here. That's Psalm 199 through 101. Let's move on we'll go over to 1 Kings. So 1 Kings 15 is our text. And here we're moving on to some of the kings in the northern kingdom and future kings in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we'll focus in on Judah here. So right after Rehoboam, we have his successor, and then which is Abijam, and then you have Asa following him. Now Abijam only reigns for a couple of years, 3 years in Jerusalem. Notice that here's a couple of things to notice as you read through these. Typically in the southern kingdom, they'll be compared to how they did regarding modeling their reign after David. And this one, he doesn't do well with that, does he? He didn't do what David did. Like he wasn't devoted to the Lord as David was. And he didn't do right, even as David did. But his successor actually did, Asa. So if you read about Asa, starting in verse 8, 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa began to reign and king of Judah, and he reigned for a long time. I think, in fact, there were 6 kings in the northern kingdom, all during the reign of Asa. By the way, this is the end of the 10th century BC, going into the 9th century BC. I think maybe around 873 is the end of his reign, somewhere around in there. and he did a lot of things that were right. And typically the things that are right, according to the author, um, as they survey the kind of the history of Israel and the history of these kings, are things like removing the idols. In this case, he puts away the cult prostitutes. And although he keeps the high places here, at least he's getting on the right path here. Asa is. So why does the author emphasize these things ultimately? Well, he's ultimately emphasizing it because, again, how the king goes, so goes Israel. So that the king is leading the Israelites and putting away idols and worshiping the Lord in this devoted fashion, so Israel will be blessed. And look at the reign of Asa. Reigned for a long time. He experienced the blessing of God because of his faithfulness to him. You'll notice also that all throughout this text, you see the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom are constantly at odds and constantly at war, even to the extent that Asa is going to some of the other nations and asking for help to fight against the northern kingdom. That also shows you, by the way, that the northern kingdom was much more powerful in terms of their resources and population and these types of things than the southern kingdom. So Judah is always kind of at a disadvantage, I guess you could say. But again, the overall purpose of this, I think, is to show us the failure of the kings in order to help us to anticipate a greater king. And that's 1 Kings 15. And then finally, we'll go to Ezekiel 45. So I promised you yesterday we'd talk a little bit more about this vision of the new temple and Ezekiel 40 through 48. Remember, that's the whole entire section that we're dealing with. So let me just kind of describe to you some of the other features of this temple. And this is not just isolated to Ezekiel 45, but let's just talk more broadly of what this vision was like. So first of all, if you noticed all the way back in chapter 40, when the vision is first given, this is different from the revelation that's given to Moses concerning the tabernacle. So remember when Moses receives the instructions for the tabernacle, it's given by divine revelation. But in this case, or direct revelation, in this case, Ezekiel experiences, quote, visions of God. And another thing that's really interesting to me about this is that at no point is construction ever mandated. So this is just a vision of what this new temple, but there's no necessarily any instructions by God. Unlike again in the tabernacle episode in Exodus 25 through 32, I'm sorry, 31, God gives him the instructions, gives Moses the instructions, and says, "Go build it." Here we have this description, but no real instructions to go build. In fact, I will argue that Ezekiel never intended this to be built, and especially on Mount Zion. And there's some reasons for that, as I'll talk about in just a minute. Well, we can talk about it now. The vision that he receives is on a very high mountain in Israel, probably overlooking Jerusalem. But it's interesting, the holy city is never really mentioned here, at least in chapter 40. And if you look at the size of the temple that's described here, it actually stretches well beyond the confines of Jerusalem's topography. So in other words, if it's going to be built, the Temple Mount's going to have to be expanded a lot. Now Herod ends up doing that, but not even to the extent that it's needed here. So obviously this is not something, this is more symbolic than it is literal when it comes to what's actually going to be what Ezekiel's trying to communicate through this vision. There's this water source that we'll see in just a few chapters coming from the temple, and it almost paints the temple as having this kind of Edenic picture. We'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 47. And then you see the centrality of the temple. This is very similar to the tabernacle, where with the tabernacle you have these the tribes surrounding the temple, and gradations of holiness coming out from the temple or the tabernacle itself. And this new temple, you see all the different tribes redivided into districts surrounding this this temple. This is different from the original division, by the way, in the book of Joshua. And Ezekiel, 7 tribes will possess strips of land above Jerusalem. 5 tribes will possess strips of land below it. So it's kind of more evenly divided. And then finally, probably the most significant part of this temple is that ultimately God's glory re-enters it, and enters through the east gate. Remember, God's glory had departed. Now God's glory returns. So what's all this mean? Well, you'll have to come back tomorrow. I'll talk more about what the significance is for this in the future tomorrow. But for now, I think what we can say is that this was probably never intended to be built, especially on Mount Zion. The post-exilic community of Israel doesn't mention this at all. Instead, when they did rebuild a temple, they built it after the specifications of Solomon's original temple. We find this, for instance, in the book of Haggai. And it probably Ezekiel didn't mean for it to be built either. That would explain, for instance, the river coming out of it. There's no river in Jerusalem. The parallel plots that are seen here of the different tribes, it seems much more symbolic than it does anything else. And then finally, of course, the massive dimensions. It's similar to what we see, for instance, in Revelation 21, where we have this New Jerusalem. And it's the New Jerusalem is this cubical city that stretches from Jerusalem to Rome. And so these dimensions and the size seems much more symbolic. What's this a symbol of? Come back tomorrow and we'll find out. So I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, October the 12th. I think we got everything. We got Psalms, we got Ezekiel, did Colossians 2, did 1 Kings 15. So hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, October 12th.